Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage MethodSpace, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Linda Bloomberg and Janet Boberg, who are going to talk about data collection methods. But before we get started, if you're new to MethodSpace, this is a blog community hosted by Sage Publishing, and we're interested in everything to do with designing, planning, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, and sharing results in all different kinds of ways. But you can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. So why don't you introduce yourselves, Janet and Linda, and then we'll get started.
Thanks so much, Janet, to you and to Sage MethodSpace for having Dr. Janet Boberg and I again in the second part of our four-part series, Qualitative Research Designs, the Interactive Dialogue series. Last time we discussed design selection, how to choose a qualitative research design. Today we're going to talk about data collection methods for each of the chosen research designs that could be suitable for dissertation research or thesis research. In my work with doctoral students, I work primarily on qualitative research studies, which is a passion of mine. I've written and researched a lot in that area. And so I'm really happy to be here today to present on this topic and for the next two topics that we're going to be presenting on in August and October, being analytic methods for qualitative research and then presentation methods. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Janet Boberg, to introduce herself, and then we can get started.
I want to thank Sage for allowing Dr. Bloomberg and I to come and provide this four-part series that I'm very excited about, as I too work with doctoral students, mainly on qualitative studies, but also quantitative studies. I not only work on dissertation committees, but I also teach research and statistic classes. So again, I'm very glad to be offered this opportunity for Dr. Bloomberg and I to share our knowledge on qualitative research, and today specifically on data collection methods.
Great, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Boberg to begin today's presentation.
So when we think about research and where these topics come from, a lot of times it just comes from our brainstorming or our identification of issues or problems or things that we want to inquire about. And really, we want to figure out how that could actually work for a possible research study. So there's four steps in kind of topic exploration when we're determining a possible research topic. And the first is, once we've brainstormed and we've identified a problem or issue, maybe in our workplace, maybe just out in the community, or something that colleagues and you have talked about, is the first thing we need to do is complete a cursory review of the available resources. And what that means is look at the most current research on the topic, find out what's already known, and then find out what still needs to be known. Then we move to the second, and we review any dissertations that have already been completed on our topic, and maybe that might mirror our topic, or at least have a lot of information about our topic. The third step is look around at the activities in which you're involved in, whether it's work, personal life, or whatever, and think about, well, how can that play into my passion for my possible topic? And then fourth, we need to engage in conversations with colleagues, peers, professors to get some different perspectives about our possible topic exploration. So the first step, once we've done this brainstorming and we've looked at the previous literature and dissertations and talked with people, is we need to identify our topic of interest. So what is our topic of interest? And then the second thing we need to do is we need to narrow that focus to some specific research problem that still has gaps in the current research. And the best way to do this is to read the most current research on the topic, look what those researchers say are still gaps that need to be, yes, found and addressed. And this helps to give us justification for our topic.
I'll just join in here for a moment to talk about this particular figure that we have on the screen right now, which is from my 5th edition of my book, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, a Roadmap from Beginning to End. And this is just one way to start mapping your research design to your topic and problem, which Dr. Boberg has just pointed out, moves from a broad topic to a narrower problem, and then figuring out what type of research design would actually fit with that topic and problem. So this is just a useful tool to use as you're trying to fit all these moving parts together, being the topic, the problem, the research purpose, and then your chosen appropriate and well-aligned research design. I'm also just going to speak for a few moments on qualitative research, which is the key area that we're covering in this research design series. Just to refresh everybody's minds about what qualitative research really is, what are the main key features? And we know that it's a field of inquiry that cuts across multiple disciplines and subject matters. In other words, it's multidisciplinary. It's not really specific to any one discipline. It is well suited to promoting a deep understanding of a social setting or an activity, really from the very perspective of the research participants themselves. The emphasis is on exploration, discovery, and description. It's not a suitable methodology when the researcher has a problem-solving purpose because it's more exploratory and descriptive in nature. The researcher is the main instrument of data collection and data analysis, and this is very important to remember as we go through today's and next time's presentations on data collection and data analysis, because the researcher is the instrument that collects data and the same instrument that is going to interpret and analyze that data. In qualitative research, research questions are typically open-ended. We don't go for research questions that will provide just a yes/no answer, but rather an expansive answer, and that is why the open-ended feature is really critical. Sample selection is purposeful or purposive rather than random, which we see in quantitative research. And very importantly, the goal is not to produce any truths that can be generalized, but rather for readers to decide for themselves what the study's findings mean and how these findings can apply to their own settings or contexts, which is a concept referred to as transferability as opposed to generalizability. And very importantly, and Dr. Boberg and I have presented on this topic as well in the past, is that the researcher really needs to be transparent about their positionality and their position and power in the research process, as this really shapes the entire process from beginning to end. So moving from qualitative research generally, I'm now just going to focus in for a few moments on qualitative research designs and the key features. And we need to remember that there are significant variations in the way that a qualitative study can be designed and conducted. Research designs are typically derived from research methods such as case study, or from philosophies such as phenomenology, or from theory, as in grounded theory. Developing a sound and feasible research design is critical to building the study. It is really akin to the foundations of a house. It needs to be strong, it needs to be appropriate, and it needs to fit with the data collection and data analysis methods that are chosen after that. Remember, each design encompasses specific ways of identifying and addressing a researchable problem, stating the purpose, stating the research questions, setting up the study, and then going on to collect, analyze, and present the data. And the researcher really needs to ensure that alignment and congruence is in place in setting up that study. In other words, the problem, the purpose, the research questions, and the research design all need to fit together and be well aligned in order for the study to be feasible and viable. There are essentially 5 major qualitative research designs, and these are case study, ethnography, grounded theory, narrative inquiry, and phenomenology.
So last presentation that we provided, we gave you a particular research problem. And that research problem was that research indicates that there is a significant number of students in doctoral programs who complete all of their coursework, but do not go on to complete their research and produce a dissertation. So despite a large amount or significant investment in time, money, these students never receive their doctoral degree, and they remain in the status of all but dissertation, or what we know as ABD. And so with this particular research problem, we found that there is little information as to why this phenomenon occurs, meaning why do these students go through the whole entire coursework process and maybe even through their comprehensive exams, and then they stop and they never complete their dissertation. So for this particular presentation, we're going to continue to use that same problem. Students who go through and invest time and money and sweat and tears, but are all but dissertations and they never finish. So we're going to start with looking at that from a purpose perspective. We have identified the problem. These students spend money, time, and they never completely finish because they don't complete their dissertation. So that's our problem. So let's look at the purpose. So this is just the research purpose example of that problem. And what we've come to find is the purpose of this study is to explore the experiences of doctoral candidates regarding why they have not managed to complete their dissertation, hence remaining ABD, or all but dissertation. So remember, we're looking at this from a qualitative lens. So the rationale then for selecting the research design, we need to look at from the perspective of the 5 major qualitative research designs. Since I've made my purpose of trying to find out what has caused them or their experience as to why they didn't complete their dissertation, I don't think I really want to use an ethnographic research design because I'm not looking to understand their culture. I'm not going to embed myself in their culture. So I think for this example, we're going to throw the ethnographic research design out and not look at that. Also, since we're not really looking at wanting to develop any kind of a theory, but rather understand what keeps students from completing the whole dissertation process, grounded theory design is out. So that leaves us with 3 possible qualitative research designs. And that's what we're going to focus in on for the rest of this presentation, and looking at data collection methods for the case study, the narrative inquiry, and the phenomenological research design. So ethnography grounded theory, we're not going to talk about today. We're going to stay with case study, narrative, and phenomenological research designs. So let's start with a case study. And as a review, for those of you who were not in our last presentation, I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what a case study is. And it's really an in-depth exploration from many different perspectives, of the complexity and richness of a bounded system. A bounded system is a unit, such as a social unit, as a program, event, institution, or organization, or a community. So we're not going to go outside of our specific boundaries through our investigation. The case study is selected as a process rather than outcomes, and the goal is to discover rather than to confirm something. We don't want to confirm something, we want to discover something about it. And Yin talks about case studies in 2 perspectives, one exploratory and one descriptive. Exploratory is used when we explore those situations when we don't really know what the outcome might be. And a descriptive is when we describe the phenomenon and the real life context in which it occurred. Stake talks about case studies as being intrinsic or instrumental. And a distinction in designing case studies is between, is it going to be one single case, or is it going to be multiple cases that we look at and kind of almost compare how our different groups responded to the same similar questions? When we talk about an intrinsic case study, it's used when our intent is to better understand the specifics of a case. And instrumental case studies are used to accomplish something other than understanding a particular situation. Multiple case studies, as I shared, would look at the same topic, the same problem, the same purpose from, say, different perspectives from different groups. So looking at our problem of all but dissertation, if we want to write a case study purpose statement, it would look like this. The purpose of this qualitative exploratory case study, and remember, we use exploratory because we have no idea what the participants in our study are going to say. So the purpose of this qualitative exploratory case study is to explore the perceptions of doctoral candidates regarding why they did not complete their dissertation. A case study research question might be, what reasons do doctoral candidates give for not completing their dissertation?
I just want to add in, Dr. Boberg, exactly as to what you've said, is that the purpose and the research questions, as you've stated, are typically suited here for a case study. As we will see when we move on to the other research designs, being narrative inquiry and phenomenology, I'd like the readers to be very cognizant of how the purpose gets changed somewhat to fit a different design, and how the research question changes to fit that different design. This is where alignment and methodological congruence come in. Do you have anything to add there, Dr. Boberg?
No, I do not. So because this presentation is focused really on data collection methods, when we're talking specifically about a case study, we know that research looks at and draws from multiple methods of data collection, which allows us to do something called triangulate that data. And triangulation really means that if we use, say, 3 different types of data collection, all of them align with each other. In other words, all of the results, in a way, kind of say very similar things. And that's what we mean by triangulation. And when we're going to do data collection for case studies, there's about 6 different methods of data collection. And I'm going to talk about each one individually. First one is interviews. And this is in-depth, open-ended questions that we ask our participants of the study and allow them to share their perceptions, their ideas, their maybe experiences, and maybe even their education regarding what that research question was. The next is observation. And the purpose of observation is to discover and explain the interactions in a social setting, which always leads me back to an example of the Hawthorne study, where researchers went in and their goal was to observe the workers and how they worked in assembly line format. But yet they found that the researchers, or that, excuse me, the participants, when they knew that the researchers were watching, they actually did something a little bit different than they did when they didn't know the researchers were watching. But it's observation, so it's to discover and explain those interactions. Third is a focus group. And focus groups facilitate discussion that have elements of both interviews and observations, again, in the natural setting. And many times we will use a focus group after we use or we complete in-depth interviews. Maybe some things that came up in those in-depth interviews need further clarification. So we reach out to some of our sample participants And we asked them to come in and help to clarify some of the things that we found in the in-depth interviews. Fourth is the critical incident questionnaire, and that was kind of developed by Flanagan, and it could be used to corroborate interview data. It's gathering participant perceptions, maybe that aren't collected in an interview. So what did you like? What did you not like? What was an issue? What wasn't an issue? Those kinds of things. Document review could be written, it could be visual, it could be artifacts or even historical data. And it's to use to confirm insights that we've gathered through other data collection methods. And finally, you can use surveys with qualitative research, but the surveys would have to be open-ended. And they, again, can be used to supplement other forms of data collection, and they're very easy to administer. But I do sometimes see a fallback with surveys, as many times people aren't willing to respond in the great detail to those open-ended survey questions. Again, we use these different methods of data collection for triangulation because it's critical in attempting to obtain that in-depth understanding of the case, and it adds to the trustworthiness of the study, as I shared before, as maybe a triangular data triangulation using 3 different data collection methods that all come back with very similar findings is going to add to that trustworthiness of our study.
Great. Let's move on then to narrative inquiry, which is the second option for the problem and purpose that we've identified as examples for this presentation. And as you'll see, there are some differences, and it's really great that Dr. Boberg has given you such a comprehensive overview right now of case study, because while that is all very fresh in your mind, let's see what the convergence and divergence is between case study and narrative inquiry. So narrative inquiry focuses on how individuals assign their own meaning to their own experiences through the stories they tell. Narrative inquiry is heavily focused on stories, personal stories of the research participants. The narratives are always interlinked between an individual and that individual's social and cultural context. Because remember, as human beings, we can never be separated from our social and cultural context. So the social and cultural context is critical in providing a backdrop or a sort of a context for the person's story. Narratives cannot be looked at in isolation or independent of context, and all the main writers of narrative inquiry, being Clandinen, Connolly, and Diuti, all make this very, very clear, that the context and the individual story are interlinked very deeply. Participants tell their stories of their experiences, and then in a relational way, the researcher inquires into and about these experiences. So narrative inquiry does require quite a lot of skill on the part of the researcher to know how to ask questions that are pertinent to the individual's stories, and then to make inferences about those stories. The approach is essentially the study of life experiences in what we call a storied phenomenon. So it's very different to case study. It's more about stories than just experiences that the researcher is trying to explore. The researcher, the narrative inquiry researcher, works very hard to discover the individual storied experience through narrative threads, tensions, plot lines, coherences, and also silences, and then composes a narrative account of the participant's storied experience. The narrative researcher also asks questions and thinks more deeply about the institutional, social, cultural, and familial narratives in which each research participant's experience is firmly embedded, and tries to see and determine how each of these stories has shaped the individual experience. Again, you see a very, very strong emphasis on the story of the research participant and how that story connects to the participant's life history and personal and professional context, and then how the researcher makes meaning of all of that. So there are very specific ways of collecting data, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But let's just take a look for a moment at the purpose and research question that one can apply to a narrative inquiry example, and how this differs from what Dr. Boberg has just explained for case study. So a purpose for a narrative inquiry study using that very same problem of ABDs, why students remain ABD and do not manage to complete their dissertation and hence their degrees, the purpose statement could be something like this. The purpose of this qualitative narrative inquiry is to collect the stories of doctoral students to better understand their reasons for not completing their dissertation. Again, the emphasis on stories. And the research question that would go along with that, as an example, could be, what stories do doctoral students tell as to why they did not or could not complete their dissertations? Again, I just want to emphasize that alignment is so important, and that is why, with the same problem, the purpose and the research question will naturally change depending on what research design is chosen. And Dr. Boberg and I want to continue making that very clear throughout this presentation, because it's a critical piece of setting up a feasible and viable qualitative study. So let's look at what data collection methods may be suitable if one chooses to do a narrative inquiry study. As I said previously, a distinctive feature is that the meaning of each of the participants' stories is contextualized. In other words, we see it in its context and not separate from its context. In-depth interviews are the primary data collection method. A life history method, which uses in-depth interviewing, focuses on the unfolding history of one person's experiences. Those experiences are both personal and professional and really unique to that person's life. In other words, the life history method is about one's life history. And there are various writers who have written books on this particular method of interviewing, among them Cole and Knowles and Dominice. Life history emphasizes the importance of listening to the voices of the research participants with the goal of penetrating to a very deep level of understanding by allowing the research participants to reflect on their life experiences and relate their own stories and present their own viewpoints and perspectives. So whereas with case study, we use various data collection methods for purposes of triangulation, as Dr. Boberg illustrated, here the key method of data collection is in-depth interviewing to penetrate life history. And one could also use some of the other data collection methods in addition to this primary method for purposes of triangulation, but it's not as critical as it is in case study. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Boberg to talk about our third option, which is phenomenology.
Next slide, please. So a brief overview of what the phenomenological research design is it's a philosophy as well as a research design in its own right. And understanding the underlying philosophy from Husserl is really important as the research techniques that we use for that phenomenological research design. And so the goal of the phenomenological study is to understand the lived experience of others, to kind of understand that essence of human experience or phenomena as described by the participants. I want to give an example of this, and I give this to a lot of my doctoral dissertation students when they're thinking about doing a phenomenological study. I always say, if you look at September 11th, 2001, and you look at the people that were standing in the footprint of the Twin Towers when the planes went into the Twin Towers, you could do a phenomenological study on the experiences that, say, 12 to 20 of those individuals, those participants in our study, had. And why this is so important is because one individual's lived experience of the same phenomena may be quite different than another individual's experience of the same phenomenon. So while we look at a case study that we want a better understanding of the case, phenomenology is studying each individual person's lived experience kind of the same thing that happened or the same phenomena. So the focus is not on the participants themselves or the world that they inhabit, but looking at both of them together and the interrelationship between the two. And the event is that one specific lived experience. And what's really interesting with phenomenology that actually I believe can be used with other forms of qualitative research is bracketing. And a bracketing interview is when the researcher looks at their own experiences, their own perceptions, their own education on the topic, their own beliefs to understand the participant's experience. And another word for bracketing is epoch, and it refers to a researcher suspending their presumptions, biases, and assumptions or judgments to focus solely on describing and analyzing the phenomenon from the participant's perspective. So I always suggest when I'm working on a dissertation committee that if we're working with a student doing a qualitative study, that maybe the chair and the subject matter expert do what we call a bracketing interview and asking the researcher or the dissertation student, what are your preconceived ideas? What are your perceptions? What are your experiences or education in relationship to the problem or the topic that is being studied? The challenge of that epoch is to be transparent to ourselves, to allow whatever is before us in consciousness to disclose itself so that we are able to put those things aside and allow us to view what our participants are saying from their perspective. Bracketing also allows a researcher to keep a very open mind and listen receptively to participants' descriptions, because that is what we're looking at, not our lived experience or not our understanding of the topic, but we're looking at how they lived that individual experience. So let's look at our all but dissertation example through a phenomenological lens. The purpose statement might look as follows. The purpose of this qualitative phenomenological study is to understand the lived experiences of doctoral students who made the decision to not complete their dissertation. Then the aligned research question with the phenomenological purpose is, what lived experiences in a student's doctoral program led them to decide not to complete their dissertation? So how do we gather the data? Well, first, we're going to have a small number of individuals that are studied, but they're studied through extensive and really prolonged engagement in order to develop patterns and relationships of how they provide their lived experiences and what that meaning is. Remember, phenomenology is not only a description, but it's a process where the researcher interprets the meaning of those lived experiences, and these are derived from in-depth, prolonged, at times, semi-structured interviews, and when needed, provide follow-up interviews. The interview questions are specifically limited to questions about the feelings regarding the lived experiences and do not ask about opinions of what happened, but rather the lived experience of that particular phenomenon. We can also use focus groups just like we can with case studies for clarification and, as always, to help achieve triangulation. And we use researchers' journaling. So the journaling of that researcher in the phenomenological study and any field notes that they gather while they are completing these in-depth, prolonged interviews.
Right, I'm going to stop here for a moment. Both of us are going to stop and hand over to Janet Salmons from Method Space for her questions and comments on the presentation so far.
I'd like to just highlight a couple of points that might be, I think were really important in your presentation and might be useful for those who are watching this. First, at the beginning, when you talked about identifying the topic, a couple of things that I think, might be surprising to some people watching, that our own experiences and observations, are important. Yes, we need to pull those into our exploration of the literature. It's not one or the other. That, the problems that we see in the world that merit scholarly and disciplined attention to dig into, that is an important source for research topics and problems. And we'll link in some other methods-based resources that can help you to think about whose voices and what kinds of sources, in addition to your own observations, might be helpful there. The other point from that beginning that I wanted to reinforce was, I think Janet discussed, you're reading, thinking, and also discussing. That, some might, especially new researchers, might think, well, this is a solitary activity. I'm going to go, do this myself. And especially for student researchers who, of course, have to complete a thesis or dissertation independently. It's your own work, but that doesn't mean that you are working alone. That, look at our discussion here. We learn by thinking through things together with others. So beginning, as a student, to find others who are interested in the problems you want to study, other people who have experience with those problems, either direct experience or research experience, is extremely valuable. And some of those relationships you make, as a student may, blossom into co-research relationships later on. Certainly, that was my experience. I'm still collaborating with people I met, as a doctoral student. And I'll just pause there and see if either of you have anything you want to add to those points.
I would, to your first comment, I really liked the fact that when we're looking at our topic, not only when we read the literature, sometimes what our experiences are regarding the topic are very different than what the research is telling us. So that can give even more justification for your study. And I'll give you an example. With my dissertation, I did it on kids who set fires at school. There was research from the 1930s and research from the 1980s, and that was it.
Right.
Yet, when I was working with kids that set fires in my full-time job with a fire department, what they were telling me was completely misaligned with what the research from the 1830s and the 1980s was saying about kids who set fires at school. And so that even gave me more of a catalyst and more of a desire and a passion to complete my research, to find out, okay, what is it that I'm seeing truthfully? What are these kids telling me? And why is it not aligning with the research, at least the United States research on that topic? So you can also look at some discrepancies, like you're seeing something, but the research is saying something else. Well, wait, what does this mean?
Right. So I think you've made a really important point. I mean, if we're doing research today, I mean, we hope, we encourage those who are watching this, who are new researchers, who are trying to think about where do I start? What are the important problems that are emerging now? Things are different today than they were in the past. So, what are the dimensions of those problems, and who are the people who are experiencing those problems? And those may be very different from what you've read about in the literature. And that may help you to identify what we call the gap in the literature, to say, well, the studies, I'm reading looked at this population of participants, but, I want to look at this other population, or this other setting or this other aspect of the problem. So that's some, I think, really valuable points to highlight. You noted, a number of the different aspects of the researcher's role in whichever method or methodology is chosen. The positionality, whether, as you just described, Janet, studying a problem that you had some professional experience with, so you're somewhat of an insider to this. You had some knowledge that, say, I would not have if I were coming into study that question. And with any of these, it's not a matter of like one is good and one is bad or one is preferable. It's, understanding what it is that you're going to bring to the study and being transparent about that is important. But also just, to think about, well, what are my skills in carrying out the kinds of activities, the various things that you've described here? Are there areas where I say like, well, gee, I'm a great people person. I think I'll be a good interviewer, but maybe I'm not so hot on something else. Well, then, as you begin to, I think just in listening to this presentation, kind of making a list. Well, here are some skills that I can see would be needed to conduct this kind of study. Which ones do I feel like, hey, these are my personal strengths, I'm good at this? Where are some areas where I might need to really set up some time to practice? I'm going to practice interviewing people, or I'm going to practice doing an observation, out in the world, just going out somewhere in my own community and taking notes, while I'm there, or even, watching something online and taking notes. What do I need to learn in order to do this?
Yeah. Can I just add something, Janet? Thanks so much, because what you're saying is so important. And I do know that with all the data collection methods, be it observation, document analysis, imagery analysis, interviewing, focus groups, critical incidents, there are entire books written on each of these data collection methods. And Sage Publications actually has an incredible selection of publications on these data collection methods. So I really would encourage people to look at the Sage website and see what books there are. There are some really excellent ones that I have drawn on in writing my book, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation. I don't write about any particular method as, as a primary, from a primary source perspective, but Sage does have some incredible titles and authors who have done so. And I just also want to make a point based on what both of you, Janets, have just said, and that is the topic and the problem is critical, and it's critical that the researcher has a passion about that topic and problem, because remember, your study is not going to happen overnight. It could be many, many months, even many years in the making when you're doing a thorough research study such as a dissertation. And so you really want to be personally and professionally involved and committed to that topic and that problem to sustain your own interest, and so that you actually produce something meaningful, that you're bringing some experience into it from your own personal life and work as well. And so the topic and then the problem are the first step. The next critical step, which we've tried to drive home in this research series, the 4-part series that we're presenting here, is the selection of research design, and then the data collection methods and the data analysis methods and the data presentation methods that will be aligned to that specific design. So none of it is just a haphazard choice. Right. It's all a very, very calculated and insightful and thoughtful choice, so that your study can be tight and well aligned and not just mismatched because you think phenomenology sounds nice, or maybe case study is something other people are doing, so you'll go with that. And then you're just going to slap together a number of data collection methods. It really doesn't work like that. What we try to point out in this presentation is that it's a very, very structured and thoughtful approach so that you do have a well-aligned study.
I think I would encourage people watching this who are, in this early decision-making stage, to walk through the kind of process that you showed us here. Try your idea out from different angles, just, at a thumbnail sketch level. What would it mean? What would be the sources of data in this type of study? What would be, my role in this type of study? How does, how would I look at the problem differently? And then see, which one you feel most drawn to, or you think will fit. And this would be another place where having the discussion with other fellow students, with faculty and research supervisors. The final point that I want to make that I'll include your references on the page. So when you go to methodspace.com and see the presentation, you also be able to find these references, because as you say, once you're kind of thinking, well, maybe I would like to do a case study. Well, you need to go into the in-depth methodological writings about that particular form. So, we look at some of the more overview types of research design books when we're trying to make these decisions, and then we dig into the methodology more deeply. But the final point that I want to make, that I think in today's world is perhaps the whole reason why we're doing this and why the three of us are making time to even have this conversation is trustworthiness. There is a big difference between the discipline and the thoughtful process that goes into designing, conducting research. And as we get into the other parts of this series, the analysis, the publication process that involves peer review and whole series of reviews that will get a look at the work, is that this is very different than, I thought this today and then I posted it on social media, therefore it is now a part of, perhaps goes viral and is part of a global conversation, but is it trustworthy? Or is it just like, well, I thought this today, therefore, because we have these channels of communication that, we didn't have in the past. To me, this is the reason why empirical research is so important. We take such painstaking efforts to really think through the work, our roles, and the ways that we conduct the work, so that it's something that can be trusted. Even if you are a student and you are looking at this in the context of research papers, projects you're doing as a student, your thesis or dissertation as a student, you're thinking, oh, this is just a student paper. Well, you know what? It's actually a piece of research that, all theses and dissertations are in a dissertation database and will come up when someone is searching on this topic. So you have the opportunity to add something to the understanding of the problem that you're studying, and take that seriously. It's not just when I supervise students, I would hear a good thesis or dissertation is a done thesis or dissertation. No, a good thesis or dissertation is a trustworthy piece of research, even if it is you're a beginner and you're just starting out, you've never done this before and you're thinking, oh, what can I add? By going through the kind of thoughtful process that was described here, you do have something to add. And as you're reading research, understanding the kind of process we've described here gives you a lens you can use when you're reading others' research articles to say, well, how did that researcher make these decisions? How did they walk through this process? So we hope that this has been helpful. You'll find in the post on MethodSpace links to the previous presentations, and then you can find information about the next ones that Linda and Janet will offer.
Thanks so
Anything
much,
you'd like to
Janet.
add?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to thank you, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Boberg as well. But thank you so much for what you've just said here. I'm very much in agreement about trustworthiness being critical to relevant research, and we're living in a world where relevant research is necessary, so that changes can be made and lives can be changed, because that really is the purpose of research, to bring about meaningful change through understanding and knowledge. And so a trustworthy study really contributes to the overall knowledge base in society. And going forward now more than ever before, we do need trustworthy knowledge, and knowledge that will be able to make a difference. So I'm very much with you on that. And I know Dr. Boberg is as well. And just before I hand over to Dr. Boberg, I just want to remind everybody about the next 2 upcoming series in this 4-part series, which is going to be analytic methods on August 18th, and then presentation methods, which will be recorded on October 20th. And that would wrap up this 4-part series on qualitative research designs, and really be, hopefully, which is our intention, a great package for student researchers and teachers of qualitative research to use and integrate into their classrooms and their resources for students and even veteran researchers, to really better understand how all the parts fit together to create a trustworthy and valuable study. I'm just going to hand over to Dr. Boberg as we wrap up.
I agree that trustworthiness is so very important, but not to confuse people with trustworthiness as reliability and validity. If you can think of quantitative research as reliability and validity, and qualitative research as trustworthiness, then that's a very, very important step in understanding the importance of both types of research. Just to understand reliability and validity kind of aligns more closely with quantitative, and trustworthiness aligns more with qualitative research. I just want to thank again Sage and Dr. Salmons for allowing Dr. Bloomberg and I to be able to present this 4-part series in qualitative research. And we hope you find it as informative as we find the passion that we have for this topic.
Thank you.